Good morning and welcome to NYSAC's County Finance School webinar. This is the final program of our month-and-a-half extended program for the County Finance School run virtually this year. My name is Jeanette Stanziano and I'm the Director of Education and Training for the New York State Association of Counties. Today we'll be offering a program on county revenues during COVID. And I'd like to first thank our sponsor of this program today, who is Vineski & Company. Vineski & Company's expertise in preparing cost allocation plans, maintenance in lieu of rent reports, Medicare and Medicaid cost reports, and Article 6 state aid expenditure reports has made them a leading provider of governmental accounting services for over 40 years. Vineski & Company would like to thank their clients for hiring a local New York State company and for their continued business and loyalty. NYSAC greatly appreciates their support of today's webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping messages for today. We will be recording this program as always, and we will be posting it later today, I would say after 1 o'clock on the NYSAC website. We will be posting a recording of the webinar as well as a PDF of the PowerPoint presentation. You can also find on the website today a click button that can enable you to download the OSC CPE credit form. You can also get that form by clicking on your dashboard under the tab called Handouts, and you can download it directly from your dashboard as well. So let's get started today. If you have questions during this webinar, please know that we encourage you to submit your questions in writing. And the way you do that is look for the Questions tab on your dashboard today, type in your question, submit it, and we will answer your question live at the end of the program during the Q&A session. Today's speaker is Dave Lucas, Director of Finance and Intergovernmental Affairs for the New York State Association of Counties. Dave has been involved in state, federal, and local public policy for over 28 years. More than half of this time has been focused on the impact of federal budget policy on state and local government operations. Since 2010, Dave has played a key role for NYSAC in developing legislative and budget policy priorities in Albany and Washington, D.C. Dave also helps to coordinate NYSAC's budget and economic research activities. Much of this research is focused on highlighting the direct impact state and federal policies have on county government and local taxpayers. Prior to joining NYSAC, Dave was a deputy director in Governor Schwarzenegger's Washington, D.C. office, where he served as the governor's federal health care, tax, and economic policy advisor. Prior to this, he was federal budget policy liaison for the New York State Division of Budget, where he acted as an advisor to the budget director and governor's office on federal budget and policy issues. Ladies and gentlemen, Dave Lucas.
Thank you, Jeanette. So today's session, we're going to be talking about county revenues during COVID, but we're going to spend a little time up front in this presentation to talk about the economy and how COVID had control over the economy. Because much of our tax revenue is generated from economic activity. So if we have a limited economic activity, it's going to impact our revenues directly. And that was a key factor in this situation. Sorry, hold on a second. So these are a couple quotes from Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. And these were near the beginning of the pandemic. And one of the first things he said as we went into the pandemic, this was near the end of March, there is nothing fundamentally wrong with our economy. And at the time, the economy was very strong. And we saw that in our very low unemployment rate we had in New York State. Sales tax really in January, February, and even going back to November, December of 2019 was very high. A very strong economy. But then most economists were saying, and a lot of the politicians were saying, COVID is going to control the economy. And this quote here is the chairman basically saying, until we get the virus under control, we're not going to be able to restart the economy. And he talks about a substantial decline in that second quarter, and then that later in the year, economic activity would resume, hopefully in the second half of the year. Having a little trouble with the mouse, sorry. So this is a chart, that begs the question, was Chairman Powell right about the economy? And this shows GDP by quarter, and you can see we're humming along in the years leading up to the pandemic, bouncing between 2, 3, 4% for that period of time. And pretty much the rate of GDP was pretty consistent all the way back to the end of the Great Recession. We were kind of moribund in the 2 to 3% range, and we'd have a couple quarters we might get to 5 and then back down to 2 or 3%. But you can see what happened at the beginning of 2020. In the first quarter there, activity started to drop off. The virus was identified in the US in January, or the whole idea of the coming here. And then, of course, in the second quarter, we saw a huge drop off in economic activity. And then in the second half of the year, we see a giant bump up, almost a 33% increase in GDP in that quarter, which followed upon the 32% drop in the prior quarter. And then the quarters after that show much stronger growth than what we had before. So in the context of COVID nationally and COVID in New York, we have a little timeline here we've developed to just kind of show where COVID was, the timeline in New York, and how it impacted economic activity. So the first positive case was in March 1st in New York State, and it grew quickly thereafter. So the governor declares an emergency in early March. We have a couple of deaths, and then the infection rate climbs pretty dramatically. And then by March 21st, the governor implements NY pause. So the economy is highly restricted. We have stay-at-home orders. Essential businesses are defined at that point, and there's not a lot of businesses that are defined as essential, and everybody else must close. So that continued from March until the middle of May, when we finally started to reopen the economy. And at the top of the graph there, you see, the different phases of how things could open. And during this whole period of time, you have to think of your essential businesses and the impact it had locally in your community. This impacted communities very differently across the state. We saw this. We thought about this. Anything that required personal service or direct contact to complete a transaction, we all knew that couldn't continue, and it would be limited. And people were nervous about going out because, at the beginning, it was unclear how dangerous this was, and who could get affected and why and how long, and all the things that could happen. So on May 15th, we started to generally and slowly to start to reopen the economy, and it was first in the Finger Lakes, North Country, Southern Tier, Central New York, and the Mohawk Valley. And then it followed on in the other regions a little bit slower. You had to hit certain benchmarks. And then finally, what had been the economic engine for a lot of the revenue in the state, at least on the state revenue side, New York, finally started to enter phase 1 reopening in the middle of June. But it was highly limited. We still had social distancing. You had limitations in offices, density restrictions, the mask wearing. And it wasn't until July until malls started to reopen at a 25% capacity. Again, the impact was very different in different communities across the state and different counties. If you are highly reliant on shopping malls to generate sales tax revenue, and they were basically shut down for 4 months, that's going to have a huge impact. And we'll see that later in the presentation about the types of stores you would see typically, you know, clothing stores, department stores you would see in a mall, and how their sales just dropped off. So we continued through the summer, and things did get better in the summer. We had that huge peak in the March, April, May period of both infections and unfortunately deaths. But then it really started to settle down through the summer months. And the infection rate was very low. It was below 5% for most of that period. And then it ramped up again towards the end of the year after the holidays. After the Thanksgiving holidays, we started to see you know, an increase in cases, but not nearly as many deaths as the first peak, the first surge. But it was interesting because in August, the New York Times reported that they estimated 80,000 small businesses in New York City may never reopen. That's 1/3 of all small businesses in New York City pre-pandemic. So it's a pretty big impact, and it was unclear how this was going to happen. But one of the keys here is, you know, as we went through the summer, Congress did enact a major stimulus, and that did help to keep the economy going. And then finally, as we get further into the year, you know, the cases did increase again near the end of the year. And then the vaccine started coming. So we had the first vaccine of nursing home patients right before Christmas of 2020. And then you can see the progression. And, you know, as of May, anybody 12 and older in New York State can get a vaccine. And clearly the vaccines are a key to stopping transmission of the disease and also reducing, you know, how difficult it is for an individual who gets it and how dangerous it is. Once you're vaccinated, your symptoms tend to be more mild. And on, I believe, May 19th, the governor said, you know, we're lifting our restrictions, everything's open again. And for the most part, there still are some restrictions on larger venues. But through this whole period, you can see gradually there's more opportunity for economic activity. And that shows up in the numbers when we look at it in a little bit. So as most of you know, the components of economic activity in GDP, personal consumption has led the way for many, many decades. It wasn't always this way. Business investment and government spending used to be a larger share of GDP, you know, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s for a variety of reasons. And personal consumption kind of took that over. And this is from 2019. These are DEA estimates. You can see where the breakdown comes from of activity. And clearly, if the individual is not consuming products or active in the marketplace, it really affects GDP. And that affects everything else, employment, personal wages, and so on. So, I mean, this is kind of the basics here. I mean, employment and income were key during this period. You had to have revenue in order to be able to pay your bills and to do things. And that was key. Businesses needed customers. They had, you know, there's no foot traffic in a lot of these areas as things were closed down. The in-person services industries were hurt the worst, you know, including tourism, and we'll show some stats on that later. And then state and local governments are restrained by available revenue. States and local governments have to maintain a balanced budget. So it leaves one entity to try to counterweight the recession. And, you know, the federal government is allowed to deficit spend, and they deficit spend tremendously during 2020 and into 2021. So this is what happened. You know, as the pandemic gripped our nation, you can see the unemployment here. And as I said, employment is key in the ability to keep the economy humming and for people to spend money and to promote economic activity. And this is the unemployed insurance rate. That 14.8% peak only is of the UI side of the equation. On top of that, the federal government instituted some pandemic unemployment assistance for the gig economy and people that were self-employed. At that point, that April peak in unemployment reached about 32% of all workers nationwide. So clearly that's going to have a dramatic impact on the ability to spend resources in the economy. So this is a map. It's a little busy here, but it's basically, think you're looking at the United States of America. So Florida's down in your lower right-hand corner. You got Washington up in the left and Maine up in the right. And you can see what this shows is it's just the I'm sorry, it shows the unemployment rate pre-pandemic in every state. That's the small gray number at the top, and then where they are today. And as you can see in here, New York is among the highest in the country. We're second highest as of, I think this is March of 2021 data. And we're only behind Hawaii at this point. Now, the average rate per state at this point in time, as of March, was about 5.6%. So we're considerably higher. And there's no state in the country today that's below where they were pre-COVID in unemployment, but there are a few that are at that level just about today. So, you know, it begs the question, and we did foreshadow it a little bit about, you know, with unemployment high and the virus still in control for much of 2020, periodically in different parts of the country, it was almost like the hands on a clock. It started in the Northeast, moved to the South, moved to the central part of the country, went to the West Coast, and then ended up in the Great Plains as the virus went across the country. And those parts of the economy were more highly impacted at different times of the year. So it was something that was spread out over the whole year, and we had to deal with it. But the recovery happened. You know, just as Chairman Powell said it would, or the hope was that it would recover as we got into the second part of the year. And it's pretty clear. The federal stimulus money pumped a tremendous amount of resources into the economy. And at the time Chairman Powell had made his statement on March 26th, Congress had just enacted about $2 trillion in stimulus, which was a huge boost. The second tranche there, the $192 billion they talk about, that's when the states and some of our bigger counties in New York received their CRF funding. And then in the CARES Act, there was a huge boost for PPP for small businesses. So this will be the first of several installments of PPP money that would keep small businesses able to keep their doors open in some regard, pay the utilities, rent, keep workers on the payroll, a lot of unemployment. Then there was the stimulus checks that went out. This provided the ability for people to continue to pay their bills and buy products and go out and do things to the degree they were comfortable in doing things. So during 2020 and 2021, the federal government enacted $5.2 trillion in stimulus, and most of it ended up directly in the economy, and a lot of it was directly in the hand of consumers. And put this in perspective, you know, the entire federal budget in 2019 was $4.4 trillion. So they basically more than doubled the federal budget in 1 year, and most of the extra spending was targeted towards individuals and businesses to keep the lights on and to keep them open to the best they could do. And by the way, from the bottom, the stock market more than doubled almost by the end of the year. It was amazing. I'm sure there'll be studies on how the federal government and the stimulus worked during this period and whether this much stimulus was appropriate or not, but it did seem to have a huge difference. And this basically just breaks down the different times in the marketplace, the impact of on personal income of the stimulus proposals. And you can see in April it went way up and it goes way down after that first stimulus was available. So this is money in people's pockets, and this allows the economy to move forward. And amazingly too, there was a huge impact on personal savings. Those stimulus payments came through. Some people spent them right away. but a good chunk of our economy, the money went into savings account because it was uncertain what was going to happen, and the money was spent down out of those savings accounts as we went through time. But we were up to almost 33% personal savings rate at the very beginning, which allows, discretionary income is a key component of stimulus or economic activity. So a quick snapshot on county taxes and revenue, where we are and where we were through 2020. We're kind of looking back at this point. But clearly, property tax was not impacted in 2020 for counties. The bills are out. The majority of those payments were made. There were some delays for some people, probably when bills come due, property taxes. But it's a lagging indicator. And if there was permanent damage in your community, it's going to take longer to repair, and you could see that later in your property taxes revenue. But in a weird way, on the property tax side, where probably some parts of the state saw huge influxes in the latter half of the year and during the summer, where people were moving to buy second homes or moving out of some of the urban centers to escape, and you saw a huge increase in property values in some of these communities. I'm today in the Hudson Valley area, and this is one of those areas where they did see a huge run up. So your property taxes could actually be something that's stronger going forward, depending on your situation. Sales tax in many parts of the state, a handful of counties were almost up to where they were in sales tax collections by July. They recovered quite quickly. It wasn't a lot of them, but by the end of the year, about half of the counties had recovered their sales tax losses. But we were still down, not including New York City here, but during the COVID months especially, the counties were down about $200 million. And as I said, it was very hit or miss, depending where you were. Some places did fine, others didn't do so well, and we'll talk about some of the reasons why we think that is. But again, that'll take quite a bit of research down the road. Occupancy taxes, for those of you that have it, most counties do, we're down about 52%. We're estimating around $70 million during 2020. And also, local fees and other receipts dropped dramatically as well. It was pretty clear. Your DMV, some did okay. Others with the limited access and the delays in renewing certain things, revenues were deferred and could potentially have been pushed out of the year. And on top of that, we had to deal with what the state was doing in the state budget. We had an additional sales tax diversion for distressed health facilities, and that was in there. And there was some new mandates imposed on counties as well. And we estimate that was just over $300 million that was enacted in the SFY 2021 budget, which runs through most of 2020 calendar year. So counties had to absorb that. So there was definitely some revenue losses. And as we look towards ARP, we'll see how this all filters out as you go through your analysis on that. Casino gaming taxes, we do have a little bit more data available. This is posted, but we think through 2020 they were down about 57% or 60 million, and there was a huge period of time where they were just basically closed down. Several months, I think 5 to 6 months, where most of the commercial casinos were completely shut down. The Native American casinos were open a little bit longer, and they reopened sooner. They have their own set of rules they followed. So I think their losses weren't as steep, but they were definitely there. I guess one of the bright points here, at least on the casino gaming taxes side, for the January, February, March quarter, those monthly payments, and we have it listed here for each of the casinos in those zones. If you are in one of these zones, Tioga was up 107% compared to the same period in 2019, pre-pandemic. For those 3 months, their average payments were 107%. You can see how they fare, but Two of them are back to where they were, and the other two are working their way towards it. We don't have current data for the tribal state compact, but in discussions with counties that have that, not counting the Senecas region, I think they're following a similar pattern, and probably, as I said, recovered a little bit more quickly because they opened a little sooner. So the sales tax update for the period, as I indicated, during the COVID months, we lost about $200 million. It's about a 3% drop. 30 counties were up, and 27 counties were down. And you can see the average in each of those counties. It was, it's a pretty wide range, but the averages are either 4.5% up on average or 4.5% down on average. And of course, sales tax is a key revenue source for almost half the counties. So very important thing that we have to keep track of. And in 2021, we haven't looked at every single budget, but we've looked at most of them for the counties. The budget to sales tax was very conservative for 2021. Many did not increase their 2021 sales tax budgeted amount above what they collected in 2020. And there were some that were only budgeting what they received in 2019 or some factor off of the 2019 number. So it was very conservative there. And of course, this is before the $110 million in sales tax diversions when I talk about the budgeting. So in the current situation, we are seeing some general inflation increases. This may be transitory. The Federal Reserve and others and economists are saying the supply chain was pretty bungled up during COVID. There's part shortages, and it's impacting industries all the way up the line. And we're all reading about the chip shortage. Some of the legacy industries, automobiles, they're shutting down auto plants because they can't finish the cars without the chips. So things are being shut down, and it's going to take a while for some of these supply chain kinks to be worked out. And commodities have been surging. Building materials in particular, as we had mentioned earlier, the real estate market has been pretty hot. People are wanting to build. A little bit of flight from the urban centers out into the country. New York City felt this the most, I think. People staying at home and not coming into the city to work, or working from their second homes. So I think there's a lot of upside potential, not considering some sort of huge event again, like a resurgence of the pandemic or something. But with the conservative sales tax budgeting, there's significant potential upside. Fuel prices are the highest they've been in 7 years. There's a good side to that and a bad side to that. From a county perspective, motor fuel sales tax is going to be up during this period, but at the same time, you're paying more for your own operations, and the consumer's paying more as well. So that does dampen other economic activity. And we'll see how transitory this is and how long this spike in inflation might go. For motor fuel sales tax, just to look at this a little bit deeper for 2020 and 2021, the COVID restrictions cut down on people driving dramatically, especially in that March, April, May quarter in New York State. I kind of forgot about it, but there was sort of a mini little price war going on at the same time. So oil prices dropped dramatically, and so did gasoline prices fell quite a bit during the first half of 2020 from a combination of lower consumption, fuel wasn't being used, and the price war. So you had a 20% consumption decline in Q2, which for the year translated to about a 10% decline. This is based on EIA and NISAC estimates of the available data. In the first quarter of 2021, we actually saw a decline in motor fuel sales tax collections. But when you look back at 2020, that first quarter was pretty strong statewide. It really started to tail off at the end of March for most counties. But the prices were relatively high on fuel in that first part, and there was a lot more consumption going on. So the first quarter we saw a drop off. But by the second quarter, prices, rose dramatically above where they were last year. Those lines crossed in opposite directions, and consumption was about 20% higher on top of the prices being about 1/3 higher. So estimates from EIA assume that these trends will continue through most of 2021, resulting in higher gasoline prices and consumption year over year. So prices are currently projected to moderate in 2022, but consumption is expected to grow in both 21 and 22, which is evident if you go to an airport, or as this summer season heads up, people are heading to their local destinations on vacations and driving. So there's going to be upward pressure on sales tax as we go through this year, and it could bleed into 2022 as well. And here's just a little history of motor fuel sales tax collection. Now, for some counties, back in the, right after the Great Recession, as we were coming out of it, when gas was $3.80 a gallon on average for the year, gasoline was the #1 source of sales tax for a lot of counties. It was a big deal, approaching 15% of all your sales tax collections, even 20% for some counties. Clearly, as prices drop, that domination of your sales tax categories falls. And now in 2020, for most counties, it was somewhere between 5 and 10 of your top 10 categories, and less than 5% of your total sales tax coming, and sometimes just 2 or 3% for some counties, especially New York City, which is far less reliant on this source. But we have a projection of the bars in red there. We're looking at about a 20% increase in motor fuel sales tax for 2021, assuming current trends continue, and that will probably level off in 2022. Prices will probably fall, but there's an expectation that consumption will continue to rise through 2022. And part of that is it's not just consumers driving around, but the trucking industry and home delivery of things through internet purchasing and other things had clearly been boosted, and we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But that trend is going to continue for the foreseeable future. Now, we're going to dig a little bit into sales tax and taxable sales. As we talked about before, the state's been really good about posting online much sooner the data on taxable sales. So again, it varied a lot across industries, very much across regions of the state. And if your business was deemed essential, you did really well, and we'll see that in some of the charts we'll show later. Just think of the big box stores and the building supply stores that were deemed essential. A store that sold everything from groceries to plumbing items was also deemed essential because it was kind of a one-stop shop. And we'll see in the data that there was a huge bump up in the second quarter, that March, April, May quarter of the calendar year, which is, for weird reasons, it's the first quarter of the state sales tax year, but that's a different thing. But you'll see the big bumps, and then they'll settling out as more businesses reopened. For the state in New York City, in about half the counties, sales tax is still lower than what most were hoping for. But in the months leading up to the pandemic, I touched on this earlier, the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020 were very, very strong months for sales tax, compared to prior periods. And November, December, January, February, the average county saw monthly growth in sales tax approaching 7%. So that was a big deal, a very strong start. And when the shutdown of the economy happened, it had a huge impact for just about everybody. Nobody could escape the problem when we had the stay-at-home orders. There was an immediate impact. It was broad, and everybody felt it. It was deeper in some spots, but there was no escaping it. So the COVID impact on sales tax, we looked at taxable sales for the state of New York, and they were down about $42 billion for the period, for the pretty much the 12 months of COVID. So it's March 20th through February 2021 is the data set on taxable sales, and it's released based on the sales tax year and how the state calculates that. But for that sales tax year, which is 12 months of the COVID period, it was down about $42 billion in taxable sales, about 13%. New York City clearly, for a lot of reasons, was hit worse. They were down about 24% in sales tax for this period, and I estimate that was about, here at NYSEC, we estimate it was about $2 billion in lost sales tax. The city does have a personal income tax, so that helped buffer that loss a little bit. But as we had been projecting from the beginning, and what many economists were looking at, industries that were most impacted by social distancing, we know the tourism and hospitality, restaurants, clothing, department stores, where you would go in physically and look at things. Although you can buy a lot of things online now, but those types of settings that were closed, they felt it the most. And some of your luxury items, businesses on the high end, also during that initial quarter saw quite big drops early on. So this is a look at taxable sales. I just have some charts of taxable sales for the state of New York. This is where the state collects sales tax, and then I'll show some for New York City, but they're not too dissimilar. Obviously, the city drops more, but here you can see in this chart, as I talked about, by quarter how things unfolded. The first bar on the left, the blue bar, that's the average per quarter in the prior year, just to give you a sense. Now, there's clearly variation throughout the year in certain categories. Building supplies, you're not buying, or landscaping material, you're not buying a lot of that in November and December. So it is cyclical a little bit between quarters, but this gives you a sense of what happened. And here it shows the $42 billion drop, or 13%, and there at no quarter during the year did the state ever reach the prior average of the prior year pre-COVID. And here we see restaurants, that one at the top there above restaurants, that is the number one source of sales tax for the state of New York for this period, for this March 2020 to February 2021 period. Top source of sales tax. Restaurants, travel accommodation are usually near the top of the list for the state because of their collecting sales tax in New York City that has a heavy tourism and hospitality industry within the city. But look at that, 41%, $17 billion taxable sale drop. We've looked at most counties. We haven't completed every single county at NYSEC to look through the data. We're looking at the data by category for top 10 at a minimum and how they fared. There is no county in the state that I have seen where restaurants have gotten up to an average quarter, and most haven't gotten any better than minus 20% that we've seen for the year. So the industry really took it pretty hard, even with the the outdoor sales, and the takeout. This industry struggled a lot. The bigger problem here too is the fact that they employ so many people, a lot of people in this industry, and especially in New York City. The trends on employment on that side are, and there's still a lot of people unemployed in the city in this industry, tourism and restaurants. Auto dealers, clearly a huge drop in that first quarter to March, April, May period, a big drop. This is the number one source of sales tax in the 57 counties. out in New York City, it's not number one, but for most counties, auto dealers is number one, and it's anywhere from 12 to 20% of all your sales tax generated in your county. This industry recovered a bit in the middle part of the year as things settled down and as they were allowed to reopen. And it's amazing how much information you can get online looking at a car to help you make a decision before you actually get in the showroom and look at something, maybe take it for a test drive. But you can see, again, there is some cyclical nature to car purchasing. There's certain, the fourth quarter of the year tends to be lower unless there's some sort of special sale going on. But here you did have a couple quarters where you got above the average of the prior year quarters and only down by 7% statewide or for state sales tax collections. For a lot of counties, your auto dealers collected more sales tax in 2020 than they did in 2019. This industry bounced back pretty strongly for a lot of counties. And part of that has to do with the price of vehicles. They're not running as many discounts off MSRP as they used to. So, there's just more opportunity to collect sales tax there just on price, not necessarily on volume. And there was a lot of pent up demand too leading into this. The number 3 source, again, this is an essential business. Building materials dealers were deemed essential right out of the gate. Very strong first quarter, that March, April, May period, up 1.7 billion in taxable sales for the year. It's about 12% increase. That fourth quarter drop off, that's more of a cyclical thing. That's probably where they would be normally. I marked it red to show a loss, but in general, the building materials in the fourth quarter are probably higher than a typical fourth quarter for building materials dealers. And again, this is a statewide number, but auto dealers, building materials, and some of the other things we're going to look at are typical in the top 5 for most counties. Travel accommodation, again, this sector got crushed statewide and especially in New York City. Some upstate counties, in the summer season recovered well in 2020 to bounce back, but for the year, occupancy tax and sales tax collections from this industry for travel or accommodation was off quite a bit, close to 50%. The statewide number of 80% is pretty dramatic, but we'll see in the slide in New York City, you'll see why the industry pretty much disappeared from down there. But this is a pretty dramatic loss. And again, a lot of employment linked to this. And had it not been for the federal unemployment insurance boost, the economy never would have been able to come back to the way it did. Number 5, general merchandise stores. This is, your Costco's and other things like that, your Targets, things that sell a lot of different merchandise, Walmart's. And of course, even in that first quarter, their business fell off, but not by much. And for the year, they were up about 9%. And this, for just about every county in the state that has these types of stores, your chart's going to look very similar, except for the numbers won't be as big. But this industry did fine during this period because a lot of times they were the only place you could go to buy certain things. And this category was number 8, and I just have to show it because everybody was buying things online. A lot of stores were closed, and this was the safest way to do it. They would ring your doorbell and they would wave to you from the sidewalk that your package had been delivered, whether it was a product or Uber Eats or somebody dropping food at your front door. A lot of electronic shopping. The food at the front door is not a traditional electronic shopping, and the sales tax would be recorded differently. But I was just making the point that there is a lot of electronic shopping growth here. Now, we will talk about this in a lot more detail in a couple more slides. But, you know, the tax laws did change in 2018 and they were implemented in 2019 in regard to sales tax collections on internet-based retail. So that's part of the thing improvement we're seeing here. But at the same time, COVID had a huge impact too. So these are the same numbers for New York City. They were down 24%. I'll go through these more quickly, but you can see again, they've never really gotten close in any quarter to where they were in the prior year. Restaurants, their number one source, helps bring up the state average. Again, down almost 60% for those 12 months. Just pretty devastating to that industry. And some of these restaurants, some of the smaller ones, and even some of the bigger ones closed permanently during this period. Electric power generation has always been a pretty big source of sales tax revenue in New York City. It's always in the top 5. This is not directly related to economic activity, though. To some degree, it might be in buildings that, you know, fewer staff. You might be able to turn down the thermostat a little bit. But in general, this is a pretty consistent factor, and this was up quite a bit during the year for the city. This was a growth area. Travel accommodation, 90% down. I mean, I had a hard time getting the chart on the page because just the numbers were so small in those quarters. Very dramatic impact here, down 90%, $8.5 billion. Big source of revenues for the city. And the city does have an occupancy tax that's different than how most counties do it. There's a flat rate per room, and then there's a percent rate that's much higher than the sales tax rate. So they do collect a lot of revenue from this industry. Again, electronic shopping up quite a bit in the city as well as it was in the state, but here you'll see that it's in the top 5 for the city. It's number 4 source of sales tax revenue. And auto dealers down a little bit in the city in that first quarter. You know, they fell and they recovered a little bit thereafter. So the COVID impact on electronic shopping, this is a chart from the Census Bureau. This actually just came out this week, and it broke down the data for the first quarter. And you can see that Q2 quarter, which is that March, which is the April, May, June quarter in this situation. You can see that huge increase in the red circle there. It's 32% up. And you can see the quarters thereafter, that elevated share of total retail sales, or the change from the prior quarter. But what's amazing here too is the bump up. E-commerce in that second quarter captured almost 16% of all retail sales. And then it dropped back a bit, but you can see it is above, and it's elevated above the Q1 11%. So it's e-commerce is taking up a big share of the marketplace. And I guess we need to see if we're up to a plateau and we're going to go and grow from there, or if we're going to drop down a little bit. I mean, there is a little drop down that we saw right after that second quarter peak. It did come back a bit, but it didn't go back to where it was. And this is another chart from the Census Bureau. It just shows that huge pop in Q1 for electronic shopping for this category. And basically what we've seen here is we experienced 2 years of e-commerce growth, or electronic shopping. Sometimes I use those terms interchangeably, I apologize. But they basically captured the market share that was expected in that first quarter or that second quarter of 2020, or even that first quarter of 2020, that they presumed they would be at the end of 2022. So they basically got 2 years of growth in there in one shot during 2020. So a big impact on the retail market. So Wayfair did have a lot to do with this. We can't ignore that fact. Electronic shopping ranked 8th. As I said, we've been going through most of the counties We've gone through 39 counties, which includes New York City, where we've looked in detail at all of your categories. But for those 39 counties, electronic shopping has grown or moved up in your top 10 rankings to 5 or above. In only 2 of those counties were they not in the top 5, and it was at number 6. And for most counties, electronic shopping is number 2 or 3 source of your sales tax at this point in time. So that is a big change, and a lot of it was driven by Wayfair, and a lot of it was driven by COVID. The two interacted together. So the state tracks the new vendors that signed up from Wayfair, and they have taxable sales identified by vendor, and they do share that report with NISAC and I believe academic institutions, and they may even post it online. I'm not sure, to be honest, about whether they post it. But anybody over 500,000 that's selling into the state, Wayfair and the marketplace statutory changes that were made requires sales tax to be collected from those third-party vendors. So these changes are responsible for a big portion of the increase in internet-based retail sales tax the last couple of years. And we'll look at that in a little bit more. So the Wayfair marketplace changes added $16 billion in total taxable sales for the counties in New York City combined. So these are new vendors that signed up because of those state law changes. We estimated that in 2020, it generated, the state fiscal year 2021 period, that it generated about $686 million in sales tax. Now, when we went through this fight back in 2018 and 2019 with the legislature about collecting sales tax on these third-party purchases, DOB originally estimated the value to be about $390 million annually for local governments, which is basically the counties in New York City. And that was based off a 2018 estimate. That budget also assumed 16% annual growth in this category for the foreseeable future at that time. So if you run it up by those numbers, the 16% growth, state fiscal year, those DOB estimates would have come in at about a little over 600 million. It's an extra 80 million in sales tax due to the pandemic. It's hard to say. It was an estimate of where they didn't know who all the players were that were not collecting sales tax, but we do know that it was a sizable group out there, and that third-party market was growing. But what we've done when we look at the data of the new Wayfair vendors, and you compare that against the electronic shopping category, 68% of all electronic shopping taxable sales are generated from the Wayfair and marketplace changes. Now, this varies by county. We have a range right now between 57 and 85% of those sales in your electronic shopping category are from Wayfair. And that sounds about right based on the state's estimates earlier. They sort of expected the internet electronic shopping category to double in sales tax size because of these changes. So, 68 is a little high, but there could be other factors involved here. But on average, electronic shopping accounts for about 7.5% of total taxable sales for a typical county. And this is up from about 2% on average just 5 years ago. So that's a combination of the growth in that industry, the organic growth, and also the Wayfair changes, and pile on COVID on top of that, and you see that boost in the most recent year. And then just as we talked about before, it's hard to tell why some parts of the state did better than others. Because sometimes the county next door to you was in black on sales tax 6 months before you were. And it's really hard to tell why exactly. But, if you rely heavily on tourism and hospitality, you had headwinds in your sales tax collections. You know, combine that with restaurants. If you lost a lot of foot traffic from the workforce that commutes into your county, you know, Albany County was down more than a lot of counties because the state workforce was not coming into the office. They weren't driving into the county of Albany. They weren't buying lunch there, all sorts of things. New York City, again, a huge loss of foot traffic because of the workforce. The city also collects quite a bit of sales tax from transit fares, which they were unable to collect because no one was taking transit. If you have unique or regional shopping destinations, you know, Onondaga has the giant mall there. I forget the name now, I apologize for that, but there's also the destinations in the Hudson Valley as well, where some of the shopping areas, and also regional venues, you know, whether it's a racetrack, a motor racetrack, or a horse track, or a concert venue or an amusement park. Those things were shut down longer, and they still have restrictions on it because they're large venues. So that's still a challenge for those communities, but we are seeing a recovery on the sales tax side. And this is a chart from OSC. They did an analysis. This is a calendar year. They looked at it, and it just kind of shows, here it shows the difference. It's a pretty stark difference between New York City by quarter and the rest of state, which is, you know, the remaining 57 counties, and the impact there. Like I said, we could not escape that second quarter loss. Everybody was shut down equally, and it was more so felt in New York City. And also, again, this chart just shows how it was distributed across the state. It's not, there's not a good pattern here. Anything that's an orangish or brownish color is negative, and anything that's bluish was positive. So the deeper the color on both ends, you know, the deeper blue, the higher the increase, the darker brown, the lower, you know, the bigger the loss. And you can kind of see it's a patchwork. I mean, there are some groupings that you're noticing, and we can speculate on why some of these are down, but it's a little bit harder to determine why others are up. You know, Otsego relies heavily on Cooperstown and all the museums and things they have there, and they have outdoor venues, concert venues. Tompkins, heavily reliant on community colleges, student census, a lot of remote learning, but that's not consistent for other counties that also have a university presence or a community college presence. So, you know, there's probably something else going on with Tompkins numbers to be in there, but it just shows you the pattern that we've seen. And again, on sales tax, you know, there's something we need to be cognizant of in 2021 as the sales tax distributions come down. Most of you know that are on the call, the tax department uses historical distribution data to determine how much sales tax to give each county on a monthly basis. And they correct this on the quarterly filings that identify the exact point of sale. So now we're on the flip side of that. So last year, New York City, which usually is a bigger generator of sales tax, historically on a month-by-month basis, was not. So they were being overcompensated, and it was adjusted and moved back to the counties on the quarterly filings. So now we're sort of in an upside down period, or potentially where they can't really look at last year's data and make the same judgments again. They're going to have to modify their distribution. We've been told that Tax and Finance is trying to make some accommodation because they know the historical data is not going to be consistent and it's not going to be accurate because now we have 2 years of messed up data between 20 and 2021. So these 2 years, they're trying to modify that, and we'll see how successful they are in 2021 and beyond. So far in 2021, we have 4 months of sales tax data, and this is, the short, I'm not breaking it down by counties. I got big lumps of pots here, but you can see that for New York State, they're up about 4.6 billion, or they've collected about 4.6 billion. It's about 280 million more than last year. It's about a 6% increase. The city's still behind, about 77 million less, but only about 3% behind. There could be a big quarterly adjustment, though, that changes this upon the next quarterly reconciliation, which will be in July, and we'll talk about that. But you can see the counties there. You're up 14%, and again, that reconciliation could go both ways this time. It could reverse and go back to the city. It's really hard to tell because the city is opening up more and more as we go. So that's going to make a big difference in this situation. Oops. Sorry. And that's the end of the presentation here. And I'll see if we have any questions. And again, I want to thank Vineski & Company, our partners. I'm going to go to the questions tab and see what we got here. I'm not seeing any questions at this time. So there is a question here about the CPEs, but we'll have to get back to the questioner when we understand what happened there. So at this time, I'm going to turn it back over to Jeanette. I don't see any questions.
Thanks, Dave. Any questions having to do with the CPE credits can be answered by the Office of the State Comptroller. What I would suggest is that you go to NYSEG's website today, just after 1 o'clock today, and go to our Education tab and click on Finance School, and then look for this presentation under today's date. You will find a CPE credits form that you can just click on and download that form. You can also do it from your dashboard right now under handouts, but everything about CPEs is really explained on the CPE form. But any questions you have should go to OSC because they are the entity that are granting CPE credits for this presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is the last of the County Finance School programs. We appreciate everybody joining in, not only on this program, but many of the other ones over the past month and a half. And we look forward to having you on our next webinar. Thanks so much.